My name is Stacey Briscoe. I'm a wine journalist and editor, and I'm here with Lindsay Hoopes, who is the proprietor for family's multi-generational business, Hoopes Family Vineyard in Napa, California. Thank you for joining us, Lindsay. Lindsay is here to speak about Save the Family Farms, which is a Napa Valley-based 501(c)(3) nonprofit, and it's created and run by a group of owner-occupied grape growers who grow grapes in Napa Valley and produce less than 5,000. And if I understand correctly, the average amount is about 1,000 cases. Is that right, Lindsay, for the wineries?
I think some of the families that we're talking about don't actually produce yet, because the Save the Family Farms is really representative of family farms that are looking to produce and live off of their vineyards. Some are producers, some are not. But everyone that we're talking about is seeking micro winery permits on their properties that would represent 1,000 to 5,000 cases, no more.
Okay, so yeah, so the name that the nonprofit gives to these guys is micro producers, and I guess also including potential micro producers. And so what we're going to talk about is the ordinance in Napa. It's called the Winery Definition Ordinance, or the WDO, that stipulates that it's basically illegal for these micro producers to invite consumers to either taste or purchase wines on the premises. So why don't we start there, Lindsay, and kind of explain what the WDO is and how it's affecting these growers and micro producers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stacey, first of all, for giving us the opportunity to talk and really explain the story behind the Save the Family Farms and what we're hoping to do. I think the WDO obviously is the best place to start, as you indicated, because the WDO is revolutionary in Napa and is a derivative of Napa's intense and I think really amazing success at agricultural preservation. And so most of the members of Save the Family Farms, if not all, are not against the WDO in theory or in terms of what the WDO was meant to protect or achieve in its creation. But essentially, as your listeners may understand, the federal government and the state regulate what it means to be a winery. And Napa has gone one step further to indicate that in order to be a winery within Napa, you actually have to meet these additional criteria, or you cannot create a winery under these specific criteria. And of course, we can get into detail, but the federal and state definition of winery is not the same as the definition of winery in Napa. And in fact, in Napa, it is more restrictive. So how does that affect Napa? Well, the WDO, as I mentioned, set out to essentially preserve Napa as an agricultural community. And in so doing, set out to essentially eliminate or restrict or reduce the potential for development. So the potential for subdivision, the potential for development for commercial use is unrelated to wine production, because the goal of the community was that agriculture is the best use of the land, and the goal of the Napa community as a whole was essentially to keep Napa as a primarily wine producing region. All of the things that we completely understand and get behind. But what essentially happened as a result of the WDO is that in these additional restrictive criteria, what the WDO said was that in Napa, in order to host tastings, which everyone agrees are an ancillary agricultural use, they are important to further the business of the winery and of Napa as a whole. That's written in the WDO. But in order to actually host tastings, tours, and invite people to the property or use the property to sell wine, you must also have a processing facility on site. And you can't have a processing facility on site unless you have 10 acres or more, or you were grandfathered in on a smaller parcel before the enactment of the WDO. So that is really the primary, I think, provision of the WDO that drives this conversation. Because the document itself acknowledges that tours and tastings are absolutely fundamental to the sale of wine, to the furtherance of the branding of Napa Valley or any individual winemaker, and that it is fundamentally an agricultural function. But because of the restriction on the size of parcel, or the restriction that you have a processing facility, those two restrictions end up essentially foreclosing most small family wineries, any that are below 10 acres, from hosting people on site, or those who have more than 10 acres from affording to build a processing facility before they can invite people on site. So anyone who, even if they own 30 acres of land, only want to make 1,000 cases because that's all they can afford to do, that's all they ever needed to do, all the business demanded. If they can't afford a $5 to $10 million facility, which most can't at that size, unless it's, you know, a hobby and they made money somewhere else, but it's certainly not a viable business, they can't do that. The other strange sort of unintended consequence, in my opinion, is that because they can't, in forcing people to put a processing facility on their site, in some cases, like for my family, we have 10 acres, but to put a processing facility on site, we would have to remove some of the vines. And so if the primary purpose is to keep the land as an agricultural use, why shouldn't we be allowed to keep those 2 acres there and use existing structures to host individuals and acknowledge that we don't need a processing facility because most small family vineyards have access with crush facilities. And that actually, from a community perspective, is a better utilization of resources and requires less development. You know, if there were 10 small family farms in my situation, if we all used one facility, we would see less development overall in Napa because you wouldn't need 10 families to produce. And yet all of us are clamoring to sell our product. And of course, you know, I think the WDO had the best intentions of reducing development, as I mentioned, and keeping land agricultural, but probably didn't foresee this fact in actual implementation that I'm talking about. And of course, you know, these are existing producers that grow and make wine in crush facilities that have brands in many cases, and all that they would like to do is create an actual economic path to viability, which is really even more so in the COVID world, dependent on building a direct-to-consumer business in outdoor spaces. And a lot of that is facilitated towards people being able to come visit you and engaging with the winemaker or these authentic experiences. And this entire community is foreclosed from doing that.
Okay. So yeah, I want to talk about COVID in a second, but I also just kind of want to follow up with what you said. So on average, how many acres are we talking about that most of these family farms have? I mean, it sounds like there's a range between like, what, 10 and 30 acres?
There are probably, well, I'm actually doing a process right now of mapping the entire community.
Okay.
And from best I can tell, there are 258 parcels that are below, 10 acres.
Okay.
But the people that we're really advocating for are people who are using those parcels, as agricultural for their crop and then to also produce wine. So that's taking a little bit of time to cross-reference who actually is a producer, holds a license, and has a business of grape growing and winemaking versus who lives on a parcel that's below 10 acres but happens to have some vines. That's a big distinction.
Sure.
And I definitely don't think that, we're not talking about that community that happens to live here and have some vines, call it a gentleman's vineyard. We're talking about advocating for people who are in the business of producing wine and already doing that in Napa.
So, and the people that are doing that, they're doing it in a crush facility right now. There is access to crush facilities. That's not against the rules, right?
No. So under California and federal law, you are a full-fledged, fully defined winery if you have a license to produce at a crush facility. And that actually is an encouraged method of production pretty much in every wine growing region in the world. In Napa, and I can't speak for the rest of the international community, but in Napa, access to crush facilities is rapidly declining. And so whether or not people can fundamentally continue to produce in crush facilities will remain a challenge, because a lot of them are getting purchased by larger companies that are filling them with their own volume. But today, it is legal and it is viable to produce at a crush facility. Whether or not it will remain so, I think that leaves to be seen.
Well, that kind of leads into my next question, because if I understand correctly, when the WDO was put in place, this was back in 1990, I believe, there was about 7,000 US wine distributors. So channels to get your wine out to wholesale supermarkets across the country. But today we're down to about 600, and it's, all the mergers and acquisitions that are happening. The options for distribution become less and less. And as I think a lot of people realize, most distributors cater towards the larger brands with the larger portfolios, because they can probably do more business with that, as opposed to taking on clients that are what we would call boutique, or, as you say, micro producers. So can you talk a bit about that and how that has forced people to focus on the DTC channel? And then it sounds like that's something that's already been an issue for you. But then with COVID and with the fires, I feel like it's probably exacerbated the situation a bit further, because now not only are you forced to use the DTC channel, but, restaurants, if you were selling to local restaurants, if you were in a local wine shop, by good neighborly favor, I'm sure that those channels aren't there for you. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think at a threshold matter, even beyond access to distribution, I think anyone who has any knowledge whatsoever of a business and the wine industry understands that a diverse view and access to sales channels is really important. So nobody would engage in a business that has a very limited, exclusive format for selling their product. I mean, I think that's true across any industry. And even the largest wineries in Napa Valley, despite having fantastic distribution, would tell you that one of the most important channels to them is DTC, lips to the glass, and that whole hospitality aspect, onboarding people to the brand by exposing them to the lifestyle while they're here, so that when they leave, they will continue to consume, whether they order the product online or because they see it in a store. So you can't underestimate the value of a holistic opportunity to sell your product, and DTC and visitation is a fundamental part. And that's why those licenses and wineries are so expensive when they change hands, because that has a tremendous value to a business. On the other side, to answer more directly, I think your question is, there is no doubt anyone who has tried to build a brand, particularly a small brand, knows that access to distribution is essentially impossible for small wineries today, because there were so many, and throughout consolidation of distribution, brands that had a chance to get outside of state now have no option. And this is a legal restriction. So without a distribution partner, it's not just having boots on the ground. You cannot legally sell in those markets if you don't have a distributor willing to take on your product. So even if you were willing to get on the plane and go sell the wine yourself, you can't legally do that. So it's essentially foreclosing the wholesale channel in most markets. And so if you can't sell locally and you can't sell out of state, where are you supposed to sell? And the consolidation makes that quandary even more complicated, because they have bigger portfolios. They have to focus and be great partners to the wineries that they have. And as you mentioned, I think it's not just that the larger companies have more to work with, but, you know, they have larger marketing budgets. And so we all, you know, let's be honest. I mean, if we're getting a ton of financial support from one company versus, you know, what a small family winery can do in terms of budget and assistance in the market, of course you're going to default to the company that can financially assist you in marketing their brand. I mean, when you think about what a small winery is essentially asked to do, I used to spend 300 days of the year on the road selling wine, and I didn't even have a phenomenal distribution channel. But that was literally, you know, picking up my suitcase and going door to door to door so that my distributor could say, well, she's helping sell her product. But I have 2 kids under 3. I also have to run the winery. We also have to make the wine. I mean, it's not realistic for a small family business, and yet I can't really afford, without sales to justify it, or distribution partners to justify it, to hire somebody to do that on my behalf. And the travel and all of those expenses are enormous. So, you know, it's not realistic to think that even if we have distribution, we can compete with the larger companies in that channel either. So there's that conundrum. And then, as you mentioned, there were a lot of trends, I think, that were just essentially accelerated during COVID. And most boutique brands, by and large, so small production, small family run brands, are essentially sold either on premise in specialized retail, specialized restaurants, because of an emotional connection or some level of curation by the teams that own those types of stores and restaurants. And they look for the harder to find, more boutique items, because that's how they distinguish themselves from the larger restaurant brands or retailers in those markets. And so we all kind of work together to create this, you know, layer of distribution of kind of smaller, unique products out of any given region. And those are the ones that have been the hardest hit in COVID. So, you know, you've heard, I'm sure, that wine consumption has gone up. But small wineries like mine have not seen that increase in sales, because where we used to sell wine, sure, we sell wine online, but people don't look online for wine they've never tried. And so where you're seeing all of this increase is in the big box retailers that never carried our product in the first place. And our friends, let's call them in the marketplace, the tiny mom and pop shops, they're the ones that have gone out of business too.
Right.
So, you know, it's kind of this terrible cycle of the access that we did have in on-premise, as we call it, you know, in restaurants, in off-premise, in those small independent retailers. All of us are being similarly affected. So it's affecting an entire group or part of, I don't know, the business chain, so to speak, or the wine industry, and disproportionately so. And so I think, you know, we've gotten very creative at finding ways to reach the customer virtually. And so in some ways, COVID has leveled the playing field because nobody's traveling, right? So I don't have competition beating me into the market or being able to spend more money when they're there. But they have names, they have brand recognition. And now without that experience, going into a store and getting a curated, I'm looking for a special bottle of wine, and having that person to interface with, people tend to go with what they know, and they know what they see every day. They know those big brands, and that is great. But how do we end up getting out in front of people? And honestly, tastings, again, I mean, I can't reiterate it enough, is how people remember their experience in Napa is where they went. And that's what they take back with them. And if we don't have the ability to do that, then we will never, ever be on anyone's radar as far as a brand. Where are we supposed to sell? Our colleagues are gone out of business. We can't get into distribution, and people can't visit us. So where do you sell?
Right. And so that's a perfect lead into my next question is, back to Save the Family Farms, what is the goal with this nonprofit? And what are some of the solutions that they're proposing to amend the WDO, if you will?
Sure. So just to clarify a little bit, there are two sort of separate proposals. They don't both implicate the WDO. And so the reason that's important is the WDO is a 4-letter word and has such a toxic reaction because advocates for the WDO, and we are actually advocates too, but advocates for the WDO here amend WDO and they're like, oh, we can't do it. Whereas, interestingly, I think the Save the Family Farm isn't even asking, in many cases, to change the WDO. What we're trying to do is we're trying to do two basic things. One is for parcels that are 10 acres or more. So the entire universe of people that could put wineries legally on their property, and by wineries, processing facilities on their property today, under the WDO. But they have been foreclosed from doing so because they cannot build wineries that are 20,000 gallons or more. And the planning department, for whatever reason, maybe just because, they don't, they're under-resourced, who knows, but they do not have a path to building what we're calling a micro winery of anything less than 20,000 gallons. And so many of the requirements of building a property that processes that much wine commercially are cost prohibitive. But if you think about it, if you're not looking to have 50 employees, you're not looking to see 100 visitors, you don't need to take the same environmental concerns into consideration because you're not having the same environmental impact. And so, building an entire commercial road from Highway 29 all the way up to the hill might not actually be important because you don't have trucks going up and down there all the time. So, I could get into way more detail, but conceptually, that's the whole idea, is that we're asking for small production, and there should be a path to permitting a small production facility that is actually affordable for these wineries that don't need to do anymore. They shouldn't be told you have to build more than you want because we don't know how to deal with these little people, with little production needs. And we shouldn't apply the same standards from these larger facilities to these smaller facilities because it would never be justified under any development scheme. Your requirements should be essentially scaled to what your impact is in any given community. That's obvious. And it's done in every other world, right? In every other industry. The second thing that Save the Family Farm seeks to do, and they're not necessarily bundled together. As an individual, I would say that, they both are incredibly important. And should be seen holistically as the best thing, not just for the members, but for the whole valley. And I can talk about that. But they can be approved or considered independently. And they don't necessarily tie into one another necessarily, which is a good thing. Because the other proposal takes, I think, a little bit more understanding of the realities of the marketplace and, frankly, the wildfires, consumer behavior, and a lot of changes that we're dealing with today in 2020 that, frankly, weren't understood, contemplated, potentially projected when the WDO was considered. So this does, to some extent, require reimagining of the WDO. But for producers today, so existing grape growers with existing winery licenses within the state and federal meaning, but who don't own a parcel of 10 contiguous acres, what we are asking is that they would be allowed to host people without putting a processing facility. So it doesn't require development. It's not asking to develop land in any way inconsistent with agriculture or at all. What we're saying is, because DTC and hosting tastings is so important to building a brand, and these are the smallest of the small, and this is really their only channel for distribution, and these families represent people who have been in Napa Valley and people who are really the heart and soul of what we remember Napa to be, these small pockets of family farmers. We want these existing producers to be able to keep their brands viable multi-generationally. And the only way to do that is to give them a channel for sales. and the only channel for sales reasonably is DTC. So if we take out that processing facility requirement of the WDO for this small group that's defined, they already exist. We can tell you exactly how many it would be. They are already producing. It wouldn't require development. They would essentially get an exemption to this processing facility requirement.
Okay.
And that's, you know, that's for whatever reason, to me, that is actually the most important. Save the Family Farms believes that anything is better than nothing. Either proposal is equal. But if you really want to break down the barriers to economic viability of the industry, you are going to have to enable these small producers to stay around. Because if they don't, then they're going to have to sell their property. And those properties are effectively either going to be into larger parcels with lot line reductions or sold for homes, luxury homes, because they aren't viable for farming. So, you know, you're going to lose that sort of that community in Napa. The other thing that I think is so important to think about is if you are a grower and you want to become a wine brand, you know, your family has a history of farming, but you actually would like to become a winery. Today, it's cost prohibitive. There's no pipeline to the next generation of winery. You see people coming from out of the area and buying parcels, but you rarely see people working up because you can't build a brand if you have to have the money for a winery first.
Right.
Like it's impossible unless you're coming in with a ton of capital. And that's coming in from oil, from tech, from a lot of places. It is not coming from farming. And I wish it were different, but how do we build a pipeline for the most obvious next generation of winemakers, the growers, without easing up this problem?
Right. So keeping that in mind, then what would you say if you could get these, I don't want to call them amendments because apparently that's a bad word, but if you could get these, you know, permits allowed, or these exemptions allowed, how would that in effect benefit Napa as a wine region, as a community of growers and producers?
Well, for one, I think, you know, it helps Napa retain the authentic story of multi-generational farms, small family farmers, the agricultural history and origin of Napa. Because like I said, if you don't find some way to make those businesses economically viable, they will disappear. And I don't think Napa wants to see or benefits from a region that converts 100% to corporate interests or non-multi-generational farms. You know, I don't think any area benefits. I think the area is, you know, most farming regions benefit from their diversity, big farms, small farms, and kind of everyone in between. And I think that that's true fundamentally with experiences as well, because you have different types of consumers that are looking for different types of experiences. And some people want to see a very large, beautiful, extraordinarily well architected facility, and you want other people want to go sit and picnic in a field and pick daisies and, you know, get to walk through the vines and understand about the farming side of it. I mean, you have the luxury, and then you have, to some extent, what I think is, you know, I like to call it sort of re-envisioned luxury, where, you know, I think a lot of people, consumers, younger consumers, are socially responsible. They want to know about farming. They want to know what's behind the corporate veil. They want to see the farmers, that authentic story. And that's the experience that they're searching. It doesn't need to be luxurious in the sense of being in a marble dining room. They want to see who are the people behind that veil. One of my colleagues actually, I think, said it really, really well, that when kids go to Disneyland, obviously they're really impressed with the rides and the castle, but who do they really want to see? They want to see Mickey and Minnie. You know, they want to see the characters. And I loved that analogy, because to me, that's exactly what makes Napa so interesting is, yes, it's beautiful, but it's host to a number of really interesting characters that, you know, I'd hate to see anybody leave because they can't make it here. And you see so many winemakers leave because they can't, build a wine. So they've moved to regions that are less expensive, are less restrictive, because when they want to start their own brand, they can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen families leave in droves because they can't pass the land reasonably to their children and expect the children to make a business out of it. And I don't think anyone benefits from that. But a big part, certainly, of what we've seen, and, Silicon Valley Bank has done a phenomenal job at, essentially researching consumer behavior in the wine industry to extensive depths over the last however many years. And what you've seen is the decline in interest in Napa and in tourism, but that is not consistent with what other wine growing regions are experiencing. And similarly to that, as a parallel sort of reality of the industry, what we've also seen is that millennials and younger consumers are less interested in coming to Napa than they are going to all of these other regions. What sort of the experts agree, at least as far as deducing the information from all of these reports, is that millennials are looking for that more authentic, laid back experience that Sonoma, Paso Robles, Mendocino provide, because they don't have this additional restriction keeping smaller family farms from opening their door. And yet those are the experiences that everybody wants. And in most of my conversations, frankly, with all of the members of the Board of Supervisors, this isn't really a contested point. Consumers below the boomers want what we're proposing, and Napa has what these consumers want. Now we just have to open the door to them, because they're going to go find it somewhere else. And Napa benefits in an aggregate from having people come to the Valley. And maybe it's cross-selling them on different experiences. Or, of course, we have to remember we have other industries here to support. So if people aren't coming to Napa, they're not going to the restaurants. They're not going to the hotels. So we need to pull as many consumers, however we do it, whether it's a fun, young, millennial, Instagrammable experience in the field, or whether it's, a fancy luxury boutique experience, one way or the other. If they come to Napa, we all benefit, because it keeps jobs here in all of those, ancillary hospitality spaces too.
No, that makes sense to me. So my last question is, if people are watching or reading and they are interested in either learning more or helping out, what can they do, either in the industry, or maybe they're just a consumer that they're like, hey, I didn't know, what can folks do? Where can they go to learn more?
There's so many things that people can do, and it really doesn't take a lot of time or energy. So I really encourage anybody who feels impassioned by this or cares about Napa, especially now, where we need to do anything we can to be hospitable and, essentially invite people here. Whatever experience they want, we need them here. And so, one of the best ways, if you go on the Save the Family Farms website, you can sign our petition. Obviously, it's more influential from a political perspective if you're from Napa or this region to sign the petition. If you're not, donating, of course, so that we can use those funds to essentially advertise and advocate for what we mean, so that people can take action. Another way to help is to contact, if you're local, you're a member of the Board of Supervisors, and advocate for them to support the Save the Family Farms in these initiatives, because obviously what their voters think in their individual districts heavily influences how they end up taking any of these ordinances that we put in front of them. And lastly, of course, I think if you're involved in the Napa Grape Growers, the Farm Bureau, Napa Valley Vintners, or a member of any trade organization, even on a larger scale, the California Wine Institute, essentially reaching out to them and demonstrating your support. Because again, the trade organizations, if they are supportive of Save the Family Farms as an industry, then we will obviously have a better chance of seeing these ordinances come and change actually take place. They're amazingly influential, and if they know that their members are supportive of Save the Family Farms, then as an aggregate, we can help push this change through. Don't be shocked that even just one phone call can really influence what your politicians think. I know a lot of people think they don't listen, but they really do. So, because that's really that's what they're there for. And
Right.
it couldn't be more urgent. Honestly, I think everybody is trying to conceptualize, how do we help Napa rebuild? And one of the biggest or easiest ways to help Napa rebuild is to make sure that people want to continue to come, right? We have to make changes. We can't always do what we've done in the past and expect it to always be relevant in the future. That was a trend we needed to acknowledge before. But now we have to be very aware, I think, that the industry is hurting. And so now we have to change our perspective more so than we did before. And that means really saying, come and try it. I know you didn't like Napa maybe, or you thought we didn't have something to offer, but we really need to lure people back. Make sure that they know we're still in business, we're still operating, and we still create fabulous experiences for any type of consumer.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's going to be the best way to keep us vibrant.
And does the Save the Family Farms website, does it have a list of the small producers, like maybe to their website, if folks wanted to learn more about those little boutique wineries and maybe buy wine?
Yeah, well, Hoopes Family Vineyard is one of them. So if you go to
so buy the Hoopes Family Vineyard. Okay.
Shameless plug, I guess. I actually don't know if all of the members are mentioned on the website or not, but you can definitely reach out to, if you go to the website, you can reach out to our executive committee. We are made up of 4, obviously small family farms, and we represent all of the members. We can certainly get you in touch with a list of the people who are interested in this. And if anyone who's listening would like to join, I think there might be plenty of people listening who don't realize what exactly the prohibition is to having a tasting room. And it might be as easy as joining the Save the Family Farms to be able to facilitate or further their business. So that's another option as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lindsay, for hanging out with me and explaining about Save the Family Farms and what you do. And we wish you the best of luck and a happy rest of the harvest.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to give me the space to tell the story, hopefully activate some interest in our cause and get some change going. I think we really, I know that when you and I first spoke, you appreciated how important it is. And as a multi-generational farmer, I can't make that plea enough. So giving me a platform is so appreciated. I thank you.
Our pleasure.